Jim Folsom Jr., the Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate from Alabama, and Jeremiah Denton, the Republican nominee for U.S. Senate from Alabama. The panelists for today's debate are Betty Quirk with the Alabama Public Television Network, Bud Smith, Alanet News, and Ted Bryant, Birmingham Post-Herald. Ms. Quirk, you have the first question, which goes to Mr. Folsom.
20 years ago, the United States was willing to send troops into combat to try to curb the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Now we have communism spreading through Latin America, we have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and we have United States citizens being held hostage in Iran. Mr. Folsom, what conditions would have to exist in the 1980s to cause you to support United States military action?
Well, first of all, I would like to say, in relation to the Vietnam experience, that is one experience we would not like to go through again in the history of this country, and is fresh on our memory. Secondly, I would like to state that in the case of the Mideast, the crisis there, that if there's one thing we can be certain of today, there's relationships that are formed in the Mideast countries and the alliances there are short of anything. Today we have the coalition of Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Tomorrow that may change. Until that time, until we can play our cards out in the Mideast, we should do everything within our power to see that the Iranian hostages are released. Our hostages in Iran are released, and we should do so as quickly as possible, because at any point in time over the next several weeks or several months, we are not sure what alliances might form in relation to Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, and the Saudi Arabian countries. So as far as using military force, I would be very reluctant to send any troops into the Mideast until we are assured that there's a definite threat to our interests there and our oil supplies affecting this country. Because the Saudi Arabians at this time are making up for the difference of roughly 15% of the oil we are missing because of the blockade.
20 years ago, the United States was willing to send troops into combat to try to curb communism in Southeast Asia. Now we have communism spreading through Latin America, we have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and we have United States citizens being held hostage in Iran. Admiral Denton, what conditions would have to exist in the 1980s to cause you to support United States military action?
I take your examples to be a lead-in to a general question, which is to be answered in a general fashion. That is, what general conditions would have to exist to justify the use of force, in my opinion, by the United States. Force is to be used only when it is the lesser of two evils. War is hell, as Sherman said. In the case of our own war between the states, the hell imposed in that war was a lesser evil than the slavery, the institution of slavery, which it eliminated. In the case of the war against Hitler, the application of military force was the lesser evil than allowing Nazi Germany to dominate Western Europe, invade Great Britain, which would have happened without our intervention, and so forth. In other words, the general answer is when there is a just cause in which force is the lesser of two evils and can be used to one's advantage and successfully, then that's the general answer. To qualify it somewhat, I would say that we should never again make the mistake that we made in Vietnam, that is the abuse of our manpower, the shedding of blood in a no-win war. We finally did end the war successfully through military means, but we did not sustain that victory later and lost it in some political confusion. But I would never undertake a war again in which the United States did not figure to win, and win quickly with a minimum sacrifice of our own, assuming it was a justified war in the sense that I originally indicated, and that there would be a better result as a result of the application of force than that which would have existed without that application.
Mr. Folsom, you now have 1 minute for rebuttal.
No rebuttal.
Mr. Denton, you have 1 minute for rebuttal.
You mean counter rebuttal, or since he made no rebuttal, I have
Or additional comments?
additional comments? I believe the situation of the psychological environment which existed following Vietnam, in which, having obtained a 4-point agreement, which I believe was enforceable, had we continued to send aid on about 1 in 4 basis compared to what North Vietnam was receiving from Russia, the Soviet Union, and Red China, not personnel, but military material aid. That's an example in which this syndrome, in which force is the worst thing possible, has taken over our thinking to too great a degree. There are things worse than force, and force is a terrible thing. War is hell, but there are worse forms. That's a syndrome we've got to recognize and face. We've got to become stronger militarily rather than stay weak in that syndrome. We've got to become firmer in our foreign policy, more realistic in our overview of the world as we become stronger, or we are going to be faced with a war of survival in which there is no choice.
Mr. Smith, you have the next question, which also goes to Admiral Denton.
Admiral Denton, welfare has never been universally popular in the U.S. Is the welfare system doing what it was designed to do? And if not, what changes do you propose?
I think welfare, in the sense of compassion, was implicit in the Constitution as it was originally written. I believe the mood of our founding fathers consisted in briefest terms of establishing a pluralistic society in which free enterprise would be the reliable drive of the economic system, and compassion would be applied to the minimal degree necessary by government to ensure that individuals who were disadvantaged or unsuccessful would not perish, that the needy would be taken care of, the truly needy. So I don't believe that it's been unpopular in the United States. I do think the Industrial Revolution in the latter part of the 19th century did bring about circumstances which required more application of governmental intervention, if you will, in terms of that which Charles Dickens outlined in his writings about child exploitation in England, the kind of exploitation of woman labor that we had in the Massachusetts textile mills and so forth. I believe that those movements of the government into that sector in terms of welfare, if you will, welfare-oriented things like non-total free enterprise, income tax, we have it. Social Security, we have it. I want to preserve what is good about those systems, Social Security, but it's now on the verge of bankruptcy because we are not being honest politics in dealing with economics. We're trying to prove Socrates right when he said a democracy could not survive because there would come a time when the people could perceive they'd get their hands in the till and elected officials would start catering to that trend. That's one of the crossroads America faces today.
Mr. Folsom, welfare has never been universally popular here in America. Is the welfare system doing what it was designed to do, and if not, what changes do you propose?
On the question of welfare, I think there are many in the nation today and in Alabama who would say that welfare is being abused. I tend to agree on certain levels it is being abused. But we cannot lose sight of the fact that there are many people, indigents, those who cannot work, and those without income of any sort who need welfare in some extent. I think the responsibility of the future Senate and the future Congress of the United States will be to identify abuses within the welfare system and to correct those abuses. This is an inherent concern of Alabamians I've talked to across the state. They are highly disturbed that welfare is being abused in certain cases. But as it may be, I think the reports from Washington show that in many cases recipient abuse has been drastically reduced over the past 2 years, and in the future they hope to nullify that completely. What I would like to do as U.S. Senator is ensure to the people of Alabama and the nation that welfare abuse is no longer common in Washington, and that we can proceed to have a system which is equitable to all, but with no abuses.
Admiral Denton, you now have 1 minute for rebuttal.
Using my original 2 minutes I established, I think that it was not unpopular in the United States from the beginning to conceive welfare. there's no question about the abuse, and I have identified through almost 2 months study from Washington to Montgomery what some of those areas are. HEW Secretary Califano indicated $7 billion worth of waste and abuse as the rules were written, waste and abuse, over and above whatever incorrect rules there may be. And there was $1 billion identified by the Carter administration in the budget for this year expected in food stamps from 1981 to 1985. So there is plenty of abuse there. I want to see the system changed, basically change the rules so that there will be less work disincentive, so that an individual by the methods and numbers of that system will be motivated to work rather than lay back. And I have figures on that, which the man here in Alabama agrees is right, Gary Cooper.
Mr. Folsom, you now have 1 minute for rebuttal.
I also feel that there should be changes in the abuse. There's one principal underlying theory in America and in Alabama, and that is the work ethic that was carried to this nation from Europe and carried to this nation from other countries. The work ethic principle, of course, states in a Protestant society such as ours that we believe in work, an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. These are some of the ideas I think that Americans have been getting away from over past years, and I think we should do everything within our power to correct them. I think basically the main thrust of my tenure in the Senate will be to ensure that any able-bodied individual who is able and willing to work shall do so and contribute to society as a whole.
Mr. Bryant now has the next question, which goes to Mr. Folsom.
It appears that a responsible economic policy will impose sacrifices upon the American public to end inflation. This means possibly continuing the recession, reducing such programs as welfare, or continuing a tight money policy. Which of these sacrifices do you feel are necessary, if any, to end inflation?
I think I missed your second question, Mr. Bryant, there. Tight money policy, reducing welfare, and what?
Continuing the recession.
Continuing recession. Well, first of all, I would look at those 3 points and look at them closely. And I think the major theory today by most economists and by most people across the country, and business people in the business community, is that we can restrict deficit spending through other forms. And the thrust of that form has been to reduce it on the federal level by reducing federal expenditures and government expenditures. In other words, attacking the problem at the bureaucratic level where the excess spending occurs, such as waste. It was reported last year by the General Accounting Office that over $122 billion alone were wasted in government. It has been reported that excessive regulation and that red tape pertaining to EPA and OSHA guidelines have contributed over $122 billion. I would reverse those figures. That was $12 billion on the waste and $122 billion on waste. I think that the main thrust should be into that area of concern instead of the other. As far as a tight monetary policy goes in regard to the Federal Reserve Board, I feel that the best approach there would be to make the Federal Reserve Board or encourage them to stop reacting to strictly interest rate increases in the past as they have, and to react to a more even policy of not reacting to interest rates. In other words, levelizing the reaction or the roller coaster effect that it has been having in that area. So those are my ideas as far as that goes. I think that we can attack the problem on the federal level by cutting out excessive regulations and also by allowing the Federal Reserve Board to no longer react to just strictly high interest rates.
Mr. Bryant, will you ask the same question of Admiral Denton?
Admiral Denton, it appears that a responsible economic policy will impose sacrifices upon the American public to end inflation. This means possibly continuing the recession, reducing such programs as welfare, or a tight money policy. Which of these sacrifices do you feel are necessary, if any, to end inflation?
Well, some of the sacrifices, Mr. Bryant, I wouldn't include tight money. I think that's more a result of some other problems. The Federal Reserve has to do certain things in the face of certain realities. Continuing the recession, I doubt, would be a purpose on anybody's part as a sacrifice. In terms of sacrifice, I would say stop cheating on welfare and conserve energy would be two principal things that we could do. I would quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn here. He says, "He who truly understands freedom is not the man who hurries to exploit his legal rights for mercenary advantage, but one who has a conscience to constrain himself even in the face of legal justification." I state that because there are college freshmen in the state of Alabama, sons of millionaires, who are on food stamps because the rules permit that. So I would say Solzhenitsyn's call for constraint, according to conscience, it would apply there. There are people who would have to make a sacrifice right now as things presently exist by the virtue of the way the welfare rules are set up. For example, a three children and one mother, say, separate mother, makes $148 a month plus some food stamps plus Medicaid in the state of Alabama. If she exceeds something about $375 a month in earnings, she loses all of her welfare payments, all but $50 of her food stamps, and her Medicaid. Now, I would reform that program so that that lady could make more money without losing all of her benefits, particularly Medicaid. In other words, I would raise the ceiling on the earnable money before I dropped that. That's one of the work disincentives which exist, and it would require sacrifice, and some people are sacrificing and going ahead and working, although it really isn't that profitable to do so. The thing that's wrong with the system right now is it causes people, if they follow selfishness instead of conscience, to lay back and make almost as much money doing nothing as they can if they work.
Admiral Denton, I'm sorry, your time has expired.
Okay.
Mr. Folsom?
I'm sorry.
Mr. Folsom, you now have 1 minute for rebuttal.
I don't know how many college students who are millionaires are cheating on welfare, but I do know that there are individuals in our society who are cheating on welfare. I think that we should monitor this and ensure on the federal level that there is no cheating on welfare. As far as providing moral dictates to recipients and to dictate constraints to people, that is something I will leave up to guidance counselors and clergymen. I do feel that the overall welfare system does need to be revised to ensure that we have no more cheating. And that, as I said before, in Alabama we believe in an honest day's pay for an honest day's work.
Admiral Denton, you now have 1 minute for rebuttal.